Apologies. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
No problem. I just convened our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission, welcoming everybody here. And we're back from our Trinity campus tour, which I think we'll be talking about a little bit more later on the agenda. So first item on our agenda is the agenda. Any changes to it?
Yes, Andy, if you're amenable to it, we'd like to propose switching points 7 and 8. So speaking to Trinity, the Trinity campus zoning amendment, and then going to the South End Innovation District.
Sure, that sounds fine. And I understand it's not as an in-depth discussion on the Trinity, more of a follow-up on our tour today.
Yep.
Okay, that sounds good. Any other changes to the agenda? Then we have our agenda as amended. Item 4 is the public forum. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to the Planning Commission on any item that you may like to do. Charles, do we have anyone who'd like to speak to us? I assume so.
Yes, we're going to start with Keith Pillsbury. Keith emailed us earlier. So Keith, I will allow you to speak, and then we'll go to Barbara and then Sharon Busher. If anybody else would like to speak after Sharon, please use the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Keith,
Keith,
the floor is
welcome.
yours.
Good evening. This is Keith Pillsbury. I live at 25 University Terrace. I have lived here with my wife and family for 49 years. I am currently on the Ward 8 steering committee. I'm very familiar with my ward and also Ward 1 because we were in Ward 1 until I was redistricted to Ward 8. I just wanted to talk to you about the fact that Trinity campus might be in Ward 1, but it really impacts where many of the students are living in Ward 8. And the number of beds that they're proposing 400 to 500, I'm not sure if that's changing because of their new news about building in South Burlington, but when you look at the numbers, and I'm just going to say that what we discovered this winter, that there were 7,031 students going to UVM but not living on campus. Now that includes the medical school students and the graduate students. So if you take those out, you end up still with 4,529 students that are not currently in beds provided by the university. That is a significant number of young people to be moved into the neighborhoods that around the university. And what that really does is make it almost impossible for the working people people working in Burlington who want to work in Burlington to be able to find some kind of living facility to be in. And it also means that they're probably going to have a hard time finding one that they can afford when they are competing against students who are, because they're only here for a year or two, are willing to pay the additional costs that in order to rent. Most of the students on my street are paying upwards of $800 to $900 a room plus the utilities. Now, when you have, we're a family of four, we are within 15 to 20 feet from another house that has 5 21-year-olds, and on the other side, 5 21-year-olds. Now, we do not have any objection to their renting there, but it seems to me that the working people should have an opportunity also to rent those houses. And because it's very profitable for the landlords or the property investors of those buildings to rent to students, they usually say to people who are working in the area or want to come to Burlington and live here and work, that they only rent to students. And if they want to rent it, they have to sign a lease that will begin June 1st. And right now, many of the students are already beginning to sign leases for next year. So I think those are some things you should think about when UVM asks to build 500 beds, when we have so many students that are already living in our area and will be impacted by large enrollments at the universities, is I suspect going to be having not only undergraduate, but as they build up their graduate programs. I appreciate talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, Andy, we're going to next go to Barbara. We'll unmute you.
Welcome, Barbara.
Hello, everybody.
see-
It was good seeing you at the tour. And your dog is absolutely beautiful, Lee. I think that's the best looking golden retriever I've ever seen.
I'll tell him you said that, Barbara.
I first want to say that I followed the UVM Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan for at least 15 years. And UVM always says, we're not going to increase our student enrollment. And every 5 years, we get to look back on what they told us and what their new student enrollment is, and it's always going up. So when somebody says, oh, we're not going to enroll more students, I have a lot of question marks when I hear that. I just don't believe it. And the reason is because, especially in recent years, UVM is trying to hold its tuition flat. And there's been, UVM tried to lay off professors and cut salaries, and there was a lot of pushback, especially from the union. So what UVM has to do for financial reasons is bring in more students so they can have more revenue to cover their rising cost of operations while keeping their tuition flat. So please have for yourselves a good amount of skepticism when you hear UVM say, we're not going to increase our enrollment, and that these 400 beds on the Trinity campus are actually going to reduce the number of students living off campus. It's highly skeptical. All right, so my following comments really address 4 goals that I have, and I think you also share in some or all of these goals. 1, we want to reduce the city's housing crisis and have more housing by having more students live on campus. 2, we have an environmental crisis, so we want to protect and enhance the environment. 3, we want a beautiful city. We want aesthetics that make people feel happy when they're walking along the street, not having cars 4 feet away. We want lots of very tall trees, full canopies, hedges. So aesthetics and beauty are very important for making people feel like they're someplace they want to be and that they're willing to walk and bike in that environment. Because if it's ugly, they're not going to walk and bike there. For example, Shelburne Road. And then last is UVM needs to remain responsible for balancing their parking demand and supply. And to do that in an environmental way, if they're not going to have any increase in parking on campus, then they need to start using UVM shuttles to bring their commuters in, because more than 60% of their employees drive SOV into Burlington, and half of their students have cars in Burlington. So what we want to do is reduce the number of cars that come to Burlington, not by putting them in structured garages around our town and busing people the last mile. Instead, we want people to bus from their hometown and not drive all the way into the city. Okay, so given those 4 goals, I just wanted to tell you what I would like to see this zoning amendment include. 1, I would like to not have UVM build close to the street. So I'd like you to reject the request that the zoning amendment allows a structure within 40 feet of the street, because I think there's a smarter way to do this project. UVM could double the number of students living on the Trinity campus by making every existing building there twice as tall as it is. And so starting in the back of the lot with those 5 buildings in the back, make each of them twice as tall, then move up to Delaney Hall and make that twice as tall. And after UVM's made all the buildings, the existing buildings twice as tall, then start filling in green space. But don't fill in the green space first and then say, oh, sometime later we'll get back to these other buildings, because you saw those buildings, they're in very bad condition. They really should be changed now. 2, I'd like the setback not to be 115 feet for the 80-foot tall buildings, but I'd like the setback to be 150 feet. That would be consistent with the drawings that UVM has given us. And 3, I'd like you not to say no surface parking lots, but instead think of the unintended consequences that are going to happen if you say no surface parking lots. UVM is going to say you tied our hands. You said no surface parking lots, therefore we have a parking shortage. We're going to use your streets as our parking lot. We don't want them to do that. We want them to have these remote satellite park and ride buses coming in so the commuters don't bring their cars SOV into Burlington. So I don't know how you can do that. Maybe you need to the institutional zoning to consider traffic impacts, because traffic is directly related to SOV numbers. And then last is along Colchester Avenue, I think the zoning amendment should require hedges and 2 to 3 story tall trees to create some green space between buildings and that traffic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
All right, Andy, next we're going to go to Sharon Busher.
Hey, Sharon.
Hi. I think I'm a little drier now than I was, but first of all, I want to thank everyone who was able to make it from the Planning Commission and from UVM to do this site visit. It wasn't an ideal day, and ideally, I wanted to have you really look at those back buildings a little more carefully to understand the potential. I listened carefully, Andy, to what you said, and you're absolutely right. Zoning really is the tool that allows development to occur, and that the details, because the zoning request is integrated with a plan, it's hard to tweeze the two apart. And I'm trying to do that more effectively now than I did earlier. I think the tool, anyways, if the weather had been better, I would have liked you to see the buildings in the back. I would have liked to have said to you, and there was a reference to the cottages that were not part of the overlay zone. Those cottages were part of my street. I lived on Colchester Avenue, just down the street across from the campus kitchen. And those cottages were actually residential properties that Trinity lobbied for and actually won from the city to acquire and use for some like honor students. I was opposed to that because it took houses out of the community and restricted them only to students. And my request through Brian Pine, actually making it to Richard Kate, was to have UVM consider giving those cottages back, because that's one way where housing could be used by residents, guaranteed. And Michael Monti, the head of CHT, I reached out to him, said that he was willing to take those on to keep those affordable. So I didn't get a chance to point those out to you, but I thought that that's an aside from the zoning, but it is something that I think is paramount, because as we heard, no one can guarantee who's going to live on that campus, and if indeed those added beds will actually provide the relief that Keith Pillsbury and so many others, including me, want to have for the residents and the people that are coming to Burlington to work, have to find affordable housing, to find housing first and then make it more affordable. So I just feel like that shouldn't be lost, and that's not under your purview. But I think that the more people that embrace that idea and consider it, understand the value in that. Now, having said that, I'm very thankful that Lisa, or whoever from UVM, Lisa pointed them out, the stakes, to show us where all of these places would be, where all the setbacks were. And it occurred to me that with the discussion that most likely they might take down the villa, that it's not historic, with the discussion that there is the potential, and there is a proposal for the high-rise structures by Mercy and Macaulay, that setback, I feel I could support. I actually feel okay with it. I agree that it could be 150 feet setback. It also could be 110 feet. I am a little concerned about moving earth and having that area built up and then putting 80 feet on top of a higher mound of earth. I'm a little concerned about that, but I will I'll just put that out there. Those are details that I would like the planners to kind of contemplate and figure out how to address. Megan's tried to address that with me, and maybe I just need more time to understand it better. But anyways, I feel that request, that setback request, is appropriate and allows them to build the undergrad housing that they feel they need. And I understood the shell game that Richard Kate said. Okay, so those undergrad students most likely will be freshmen and sophomores. That's the reality. But he's hoping that, note I say hoping, that in providing those units, that some students that are currently housed elsewhere on campus will be housed at Trinity, freeing up units elsewhere that might be more desirable for juniors and seniors, which once again may get some of those students, which Keith Pillsbury was referencing, out of the neighborhoods and then free up some housing. So I sort of understand the shell game. It's complicated and there's no guarantee, but I do appreciate that, and I can accept that that it's plausible. It's plausible, not guaranteed, but plausible. I continue to be concerned about the removal of the slope and the graduate student housing that is close to Colchester Avenue. And I really feel that I would like you to have approve one of their requests and delay the second request. I really feel that other options really haven't been explored. If they take down the villa, and I don't know if they will, but if they take down the villa, there's another parcel, another spot that they can build on. If they look at the parking behind Delahunty, and there needs to be a geotech analysis of that area, you can build away from the slope. I'm pretty sure you can. How close to the slope? I don't know, but I think that there is potential for housing there, and I think there's potential to preserve the surface parking there also. So those are really my thoughts about all of this. I did want to mention that I sent, and I didn't have a chance to ask Megan Tuttle if she had passed this on, but I sent her some pictures, which I thought really you all should have a chance to see. And I framed it with a brief communication. It was on move-in days, there were 4 days, and at at Trinity campus, and there was not a blade of grass showing from the villa all the way down, all the way back to Mercy. There was it was a blanket of cars. It was a mess. And why am I mentioning that? Well, you know, up until now, I've really been a little bit soft on saying, well, parking's going to be addressed. It's going to be addressed. Well, I felt like that brought home to me the fact that, yes, when you have move-in, it's only 4 days a year. So what? You're not going to, you know, pave over paradise for that. That's not what I'm proposing. But what I'm concerned about is if you have more beds, and how are you going to orchestrate that move in? And I'm worried about Colchester Avenue and East Avenue. Why? Well, yeah, I happen to live in the neighborhood, but the other piece that I want to bring to everyone's attention is this medical center, which I worked at for 50 years, is a level 1 trauma center for adults, a level 2 trauma center for kids. And if indeed those cars spill over into the streets and cause some traffic jams on those 4 days, these are ambulance routes, and you're going to put someone's life at risk. And that troubles me. That really, really troubles me. Now, you might say, well, what about in the spring? Well, in the spring, people's exams are at different times, and that doesn't happen. So that congestion is experienced only at move-in day, but it's an important 4 days. And if it was your loved one who might not get there on time to the hospital, I think it matters. So I really think that parking needs to be thought about carefully, moving people around, having a plan. And clearly, I feel that I know that your limit for review and for zoning amendments, well, I know you can approve zoning amendments, but I know UVM is an entity that doesn't get the same kind of level of review that other entities do. And so I'm really worried about this as you grant zoning amendments and then proposals come to the DRB, and that would be where the parking would kind of fall. So I'm sorry, I hope that wasn't too convoluted, but I'm trying to make my point, and I hope you get to see the pictures and the communication I provided to Megan. So thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and I look forward to your dialogue and your decision-making.
Thank you, Sharon. Charles, do we have anyone else?
Andy, we have a few folks in the attendees list, but nobody else has raised your hand. I'm just gonna say one more time, if you would like to speak, please use the raise hand icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll give you a few moments to find that. And Andy, it does not look like anybody is raising their hand, so that looks like it's it.
Okay, well then, thank you for those who spoke tonight. We appreciate your comments. And we'll close the public forum and move on to the chair's report. And for my report, I just want to, again, thank Megan and the folks at UVM for helping set up today's site visit at the Trinity campus. I do think that sometimes doing the site visits as we're trying to do contemplating zoning changes really is helpful to help put things in context. You know, I think there's a lot of value to that. And I think on this one, it was suggested by, Barbara and/or Sharon that we do this. So to the two of you, thanks also for your suggestion on that. And I think it was really helpful. So thanks to everybody who participated and helped to make it. And with that, I'll turn it over to Megan for the director's report.
Great, thanks, Andy. And thanks to the commissioners that are here that came to the tour and being willing to be game, even though the weather looked pretty sketchy there a couple hours before the meeting. We took a risk that it would do what it did, which was largely positive, and so I'm glad it worked out for us to be able to do that. A couple quick updates. Last night at the city council meeting, the council held their public hearing on 2 of the zoning amendments that you had recently reviewed and referred to them. This was for the short-term rental amendments, which was a complement to all of the details that they had adopted as part of the housing code earlier this year. So kind of a technical in nature amendment at this point, but they did hold that hearing and then adopted those changes afterwards. So all of the different pieces of the short-term rental ordinance are in effect now. And Scott and his team at the Department of Permitting and Inspections have been working very hard with the company that is helping us to actually kind of gain access to real live data about the short-term rentals that are operating in Burlington and make sure that they all get the appropriate registrations and permits. The other amendment that the City Council had on their agenda was the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Amendment. They did hold the public hearing on that, but they delayed their deliberation on it until October. So we'll update you once we know more about what they do with that one. As far as things that are coming up in our office, I think we had shared a couple weeks back that we have started some of our early work on the Missing Middle project, and you'll start to see this more frequently on your agendas after we get through some of the Trinity and South End zoning work. But did want to plug that if anyone's interested in learning more about what Missing Middle means, we are collaborating with AARP next Thursday night at 5 p.m. To have a walking tour of some missing middle housing examples that are in the kind of South End neighborhood, just to the southeast of downtown. So we'll meet at Smalley Park at 5, and it'll be about an hour-long tour where we'll look at some examples of existing missing middle housing types in that neighborhood. We're also planning another tour of some examples in the Old North End on a weekend. I think it'll be October 9th. In collaboration with Preservation Burlington. So we'll share more information as the date for that one approaches as well, but wanted to share in case you're interested in attending.
Thank you. You're all set?
I believe so. Charles, was there anything else that I should mention at this point?
No, not that I can think of. No.
Okay, great. All set?
All right, good. Thanks, Megan. So we're going to jump over item 7 for now. We'll come back to it in a moment, but we're going on to item 8, which is the proposed CDO amendment for UVM Trinity campus zoning. Originally, I think we were going to be having a fuller discussion of this, but I think at this point we are going to be just following up on our site visit. Is that right, Megan?
Great, that's correct. So there were a lot of questions that were asked, and I hope everyone was able to hear most of the answers to during our tour. But for the benefit of anyone that wasn't able to be there, or any kind of follow-up questions that came up for you that you wanted to ask, Lisa Kingsbury is also here. We can set her up so that she can answer questions. We just wanted to offer an opportunity for any observations or questions as a follow-up to that we can make sure to discuss at our next meeting. So not sure if the commission has anything in follow-up.
Any questions or comments from anyone?
Okay.
If not, I think we'll be having our fuller discussion at the next meeting.
It does look like Julia has her hand up.
Oh,
Andy?
Julia, sorry.
Yeah, I just I have 2 questions. One is a point of clarification that we're approving a zoning amendment and not any specific plan for the area, and that, you know, those things are subject to change in the future. And then my other question is, my other question relates to any data that UVM has about how consistently their other dorms have any vacancies, and if they have any understanding of the class years of those students. So just to add some context to the conversation that we had at the site visit, and also in the public comment earlier about juniors and seniors possibly remaining on campus and filling in, or just the dynamic of trying to make living on campus more appealing to those folks.
So let me try and tackle your first question, then I'll turn it over to Lisa and or Megan for the second half. In terms of your first question, you're right. We're not looking at a site plan. I mean, UVM has proposed a site plan to put things in context, but we're not approving or disapproving that. We're really only looking at that in terms of things that can be done on campus. And it may be that that's what they actually present to the DRB, but we're just doing a zoning change. And so we're really just looking at what are the parameters for which development can be done there. What are the scope of it, what are the limits of it, what can be done, what can't be done, where things can be done. We looked a lot at the setbacks. And so those are all the things that we're doing, is just call it the bigger picture of enabling them to be able to do stuff on that, different stuff on that campus. But we're not doing particular site plans or anything like that. That they'll have to do that later. Some of it may be presented administratively, some of it may be presented to the DRB, and how they have to do it can be up to us to a certain extent over what's permitted, what's conditional, things like that. But yes, so on to the second half of the second part of your question. I'm not sure who the best one is for that, whether it's Lisa or Megan.
Yeah, I think that question would be best for Lisa to take on. And I know she was coming over as a panelist, I think, as the question was being asked. So to just quickly recap, if they have any data about occupancy of their dorms, and specifically occupancy of the dorms by grade level.
Yeah, I can talk sort of in general terms right now. I don't have that data right in front of me. We shared earlier with the commission our enrollment numbers and our housing capacity over the last from 2009 to today. I don't know, Julie, if you've had a chance to look at any of that, and welcome. I didn't realize that you were a commissioner either when we were on the tour. We did share some of that data. Capacity wise, I would say we usually look, when we talk to the city, we usually look at enrollment and bed capacity. In terms of vacancies, I can say in my, with what I've seen with Res Life over the years, we're generally very full, particularly, and I talked about this a little bit, I think just before, maybe it was just after, we walked around that, we're particularly on the first day of classes, we tend to be very full. And then there's some what we call enrollment melt, where students may transfer off to another institution or decide to go home, or whatever they do for that year. But generally we're pretty full. I don't have junior, senior data broken down right now. What I can say, just kind of again in generalizations, is that over the years, if I were to look at that 2009 to 2021 data, there have been years where we've had junior seniors within the residence halls. I will note there are junior seniors that live outside of the residential life system on campus in our affiliate housing. So there is Redstone Lofts, Redstone Apartments, that's junior seniors and grad students. But it is, I think, true that over the last couple of years, we really haven't had room for those juniors and seniors to live there. So now I would say that number is very low, if any, on campus. But in other years, we've had, a few hundred at a time. Maybe I can certainly, if that's something the commission wants to take a look at, I can get better data. I'm just kind of talking, off the top of my head right now. But generally, that's how we've been over the years.
I would also be interested in seeing that, Lisa. Thank you.
We can work with Lisa to have some more information about that kind of mix of who's living on campus at your next meeting. And then I think just the only thing I would add that I don't think that Lisa mentioned is that UVM's policy is that freshmen and sophomores are required to live on campus.
Yes, thank you for that, for pointing that out. Yes, freshmen and sophomores do live on campus, required to.
Okay. Any other questions from the commission? Oh, I'm sorry, Andy. I totally took over asking that.
That's fine. Emily?
Yeah, I'm wondering if UVM Lisa, if you could address Sharon's concerns about parking during move in and move out, and those pictures of all the cars on
Yeah,
on the spot
yeah.
there.
And Sharon and I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and Sharon and I talked about that a little bit this year. You know, I've helped out with move-in in other parts of campus. I haven't actually been over at Trinity, so I was a little surprised to see the number of cars that were on the lawns as well. You know, I think that is something that we'll have to take a look at as we develop in that area and what the circulation looks like. We do have other areas of campus where there is not parking and it's highly managed. Central Campus Residence Hall, which is our newest dorm right in the center of campus that does not have a large parking lot near it to be able to service students, is very carefully managed in the way that, you know, how we get students cars, or students or parents cars, whoever's dropping off, as we bring them down. And then, you know, we have a lot of faculty and staff who help standing there and grab everyone's boxes and bring them right up to their rooms. But that is one area of campus where it works because we spend a lot of time making sure that the traffic flow works. But I do think that is something that we'll have to look at. Of course, we don't want to cause any sort of a traffic backup that would impact emergency access to the hospital at all.
The only other thing I'll add from the perspective of the kind of city and the process we're going through is that a similar question came up at the council's ordinance committee when we were talking about the BHS zoning and the maximum parking limits that would apply to the high school's property. You know, Sharon asked some great questions about, you know, what happens during sporting events. And I think one of the things that we understand as a commission when we're working on zoning policy like this is trying to find the right balance between allowing for some parking without requiring an excessive amount of parking to be built for these special circumstances that happen very infrequently. So certainly our ordinance would try to encourage looking for shared parking opportunities. And Lisa and I did talk about this the other day to see if there's any kind of parking in the immediate vicinity that could maybe be used during move-in, that would help to offset some of those concerns so that we don't have to focus on building all of those parking needs directly on the Trinity campus.
Anyone else? All right, then,
Andy, I'm sorry. There were two questions that I was going to ask Lisa if she could speak to. One of the questions that came up on the tour tonight that I think might be helpful for the other commissioners to hear is about the request that the existing 115-foot setback from Colchester Avenue, that kind of become the setback for a new taller height that would be allowed on the campus, the 80-foot height. There was a question just kind of about how we arrived at that number. And I suspected it was because it's the existing setback line, that you were just requesting that setback be repurposed as the place where the taller height would be allowed, but wasn't sure if there were any other factors that led to that request from UVM.
I think it was also looking at the campus. Excuse me. That setback line, if we didn't go closer to Mann Hall, but if we had walked over, you would have seen that the stakes stopped as we got to that area because that setback kind of goes through the road and close to Mann Hall. So it was more looking at Mann Hall as one of the taller buildings. That actually is the tallest building on Trinity campus, and thinking that it would make sense to align it with that. And then behind it was really where we came up with the 115 feet.
And oh, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I'm quite following this. So there's a revised I feel like I missed something on the 115 feet in a taller building that has been referenced.
Yeah, so there was so one of our requests is the height overlay, which is where we're asking to have a height of 80 feet
Oh, okay.
From
So
that 115 feet.
apologize.
back.
Just
Yeah, yeah.
understand.
And I believe it was Barbara had asked while we were on the site visit, she looked at the drawings of the conceptual housing, and that is a little bit further back. So her request was to move that height back to what this plan, conceptual plan at this point for housing is, which she was estimating it more like 150 feet. I haven't done the measurement. I don't know exactly what that is.
Okay, thank you. And then one other question, I know that some of us have heard is just if you could speak a little bit about the plans in South Burlington and if any of your anticipated work at Trinity is impacted by the project that was announced in South Burlington.
Yeah. So yes. So if anybody missed that news, UVM is partnering with a private development firm to build housing in South Burlington City Center. But I believe it's 500 beds, and that would be for UVM faculty, staff, and also graduate students. And it does not impact the work that we're doing on Trinity and continuing to look to, potentially get the zoning change and then move forward with design on these new housing projects. It hasn't changed our focus on that at all. I think, we are all aware that there are housing issues in the community, and the South Burlington project is just another way to look at that. We know our grad students, are needing some housing, and our faculty staff are, we've heard from them as well. So this was something that, quite frankly, will move a little bit faster than where we are now, where we're still working through this zoning change. That project the developer will be taking it into permitting. They don't need the zoning change to do that one, but it does not change anything here.
Megan, did you have anything else?
No, those were my questions, Andy. Thanks.
Alex?
I just wanted to say, I think it's fantastic the university is going to build apartments in South Burlington for faculty, staff, graduate students. I don't think it mitigates the problem of future graduate students or undergraduate students moving off campus from when they age out of Trinity, but I think it's great news that the university is undertaking this because it's needed.
Thank you.
So
yeah, it's a good location for that population.
Anyone else? Michael?
I was going to ask just kind of what next steps are. Maybe you're going to address that.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Andy, if you'd like.
Sure.
So at the next meeting, we're going to come back to you with hopefully the final version of the proposed amendments and talk through the kind of last piece that we haven't discussed yet, which is the master planning piece. And then I think from there, if the commission feels ready, we would ask you to think about warning a public hearing on this so that we could continue to move this forward for discussion and consideration by the city council. So that's why I think, tonight it'd be great to know if there's anything else that would be helpful for you to know from UVM or the city in order for us to finalize that discussion next week.
Michael?
I guess kind of on the subject of South Burlington, I mean, Lisa, you probably really can't share, but I suppose in terms that you could share, is the university evaluating other sites that are away from main campus for housing? And the reason I ask is, I mean, it's nice. I think it alleviates pressure. It's nice that something can get done very quickly, but at the same time, those are folks that it'd be nice to have close to the university environment, that learning environment, and those tend to be the folks that are going to be there. Those that are, I suppose, neighbors are happiest to have nearby. And obviously there's some undeveloped parcels. So it's good news, but at the same time, it's also a little bit bad news. So as we consider this, I just wondered if the university was also evaluating other sites if they believe the need continues to exist.
And I think there's, sites that we are continuing to look at. This, we don't have this zoning change right now, and there's no guarantee that you all are going to pass it and that we'll be able to do what we want to do. So, we are continuing to look. I don't believe we're looking at anything that is outside of UVM's campus lands at this point, that I'm aware of anyway. I will say, you know, we have developers come to us all the time to say, I have this project and I'd like you to come and talk to me about it. And we have those conversations. There's nothing I know of that's moving forward right now, but so I would say our focus right now is on UVM campus lands.
Good, thanks. Anything else? All right, then we'll close this item. Thank you, Lisa. Thanks everyone else. Oh, Julia, did you have something before we close out?
Yeah, I forgot to mention earlier, I am interested in continuing conversation about the role of multimodal transportation in this overlay district, and any language and standards that would be related to that, given that there will be a lot more pedestrians and bicyclists as a result of increased density in that area. And then there was some discussion in the public comments section earlier about green space. And, you know, given that there are some steep slopes in the area as well, I think I'd like to continue that discussion next time as well about open space on the parcel and any values for green space in that area.
Thank you. I think that is it. I'm not seeing anybody else. So again, thank you everyone for weighing in on this one, and we'll close it out and move back to item 7, which is the proposed CDO amendment, South End Institution District Overlay. I think this is you, Charles.
Yes, 1 second. Let me just do some housekeeping here. All right, thanks, Megan. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and resume our discussion from the previous session. So today,
Charles, I just want to interrupt you for 1 second as you're getting started.
Yep.
When we're on the, just to remind folks that when we're sharing the screen like this, I don't see everybody, so I can't tell if anybody wants to speak. So if anybody's wanting to ask a question along the way, just chime in. Use your discretion, but just chime in if you feel the need to, because I won't be able to call on you. So that, thanks, Charles.
great, thanks, Andy. So today we are going to recap our discussion from last time. You all did raise some issues that we want to focus the discussion on tonight. So the way we're proposing to do this is to run through the presentation that we gave last time, touch very briefly on the issues that you really didn't discuss or didn't seem concerned with in the amendment. And we've created some slides specifically to facilitate some discussion on some of those issues that you raised. Those issues specifically include those at the bottom of your memo, or at least page 2 of your memo. So hotels and hospitality were discussed. The granularity of blocks as the district is built out was discussed. Building performance, residences for artists, and remediation incentives were included. There are some other issues that we added to the list, and you'll see those on some blue slides that pop up. So again, for those attending the meeting who were not here last time, we're going to run through the presentation, summarize it quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on any of these slides. So commissioners, if you have any, if you want to discuss anything that I'm quickly jumping over, feel free to stop me at any time and we can have that conversation. So again, the key question here with the South End Innovation District is how can we implement a key initiative from Plan BTV South End to create a district that will facilitate the continued prosperity and growth of the South End's artist and maker community while accommodating the burgeoning office district and making space for new homes. Again, this is the boundary of the proposed innovation district. Yep, so again, you didn't really discuss this last time at length, but at any point in tonight's conversation you'd like to do that, feel free. I'm going to skip over the intent here. I think we all know that. Again, this is a combination sort of initiative coming out of Plan BTB South End along with the mayor's 10-point housing plan. So again, just to briefly recap, the land use concept behind the zoning amendment is to create a series of, or a category of permitted uses that includes some residential uses, arts and making uses, office and community uses. Community uses being things like, you know, healthcare, childcare, that sort of thing. And then another category of more limited but still permitted uses that we consider ancillary, but very much supportive of a mixed-use urban district. And then a final category of uses that we propose shall not be permitted. So I'm gonna, again, jump through these. And first issue that we wanted to raise, and this is something that we've been thinking about throughout the process of drafting this amendment, is it's whether residential uses, which are not permitted today, but are proposed to be permitted, should be permitted only in new buildings. The rationale for permitting them only in new buildings is basically to preserve existing non-residential space, specifically office space and artist and maker space in the South End. Obviously, there are no residential uses in the proposed innovation district today. And also the fact that converting non-residential space, particularly office space, can be very costly and frankly not feasible in many situations. And so this is, you know, I should pause here to say, we have decided not to amend the language in the, to revise the language in the amendment today, but really the goal of tonight's discussion is to focus on these issues so that we can bring back a revised draft to you next time. Hopefully with the goal of warning a public hearing in the next meeting or two. So that, yeah, that this is an issue that, you know, staff believes is appropriate to include in the amendment, but would love to hear the commission's thoughts on permitting residential uses, but only in new buildings.
Charles?
Yes.
On this one, I guess I'm just not clear if staff has a recommendation on which way to go on this.
Yeah, so Andy, sorry, let me be a little bit clearer. I think we do, as staff, recommend that residential uses should be permitted only in new buildings. You know, just to use an example, the Innovation Center is one building that has been converted from a previous use to now office use. And in the event that a developer came and said, oh, I'd like to convert this to residential, that could represent a significant loss of existing office space in the innovation district, could represent potential loss of artist and maker space to the extent that it exists in that building. There are not many existing buildings in the district today, aside from a few city, so BED, DPW have their offices here. Obviously, Hula, the Innovation Center, Generator. There's a few other smaller industrial manufacturing buildings, but this is to say that there is much space in the Innovation District to accommodate new residential buildings. And so, yes, we are recommending that only new buildings should be only residential in new buildings.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
I gotta say, Charles, can you go back to that satellite overview real quick? I
Yes,
think that was helpful.
this one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Michael, if you want to chime in, I don't think Andy can see your hand.
Oh, okay, yeah, I guess the only, it sounds like you answered this, but obviously, and I'm sure you've thought about this, the only like obvious downside, right, is that like you provide some incentive to demolish something rather than reusing something. Seems like it'd only be an issue if you had smaller, smaller buildings. I'm just trying to look at the satellite as well, but I just raise it as a consideration. Kind of unintended consequences.
Sure. Yeah, that is, that is something we've thought about, but on balance, I think just given the sheer amount of undeveloped space in the district, on almost every lot that's in the proposed boundary, we do think that there's space to accommodate new residential uses while still preserving that existing space.
Yeah, I think like looking at it and reminding myself of what's there. Don't want to speak out of turn, obviously, for anybody, but like, if the dealer site, for example, was to no longer be occupied, that's not a particularly, that's a single story building that, unlike the Innovation Center, doesn't seem like it'd be a huge lift to tear down. So just, as a kind of caution in terms of what's trying to be accomplished.
Yeah, and dealer actually is not within the proposed overlay boundary.
The one that's adjacent to the service right behind the electric department.
Oh, that dealer building. I'm sorry. You're talking about on
Yep.
the back of the Innovation Center lot. I was
Yep.
thinking you meant over on Pine Street.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that there are kind of some smaller buildings within this area that, that could be a risk for. But I think as Charles mentioned, so many of these sites have so much undeveloped surface area that I think the risk of that would be mitigated in many places because of the opportunity to have kind of lower barrier development sites.
Michael? What are
Yes.
you imagining, like, that if, say, this project, gets built in 5 years, 5 years after that, the market for, residential is so hot that developers are knocking down existing commercial or non-residential buildings and putting up new residential, like that's
Yeah,
what, is
exactly.
that the unintended consequence?
Precisely, yeah, because like, they might just say, hey, it's worth the incremental cost of knocking anything down. I think for the Innovation Center, like that would be a very expensive proposition, right? That's a very big building.
No,
But-
yeah, that's not going anywhere.
Something like the ancillary dealer building, you might lose that you might lose that commercial space, I guess, that non-residential space.
Right, and I do think that's an important point to make, is that the kind of reason that we were considering this limitation is actually to address the concern about the loss of the commercial space. So even if the building itself remains, but is converted to residential, it could still result in the loss of that commercial space. So we were just trying to think through one kind of additional layer of protection that could be offered for those existing buildings that host commercial space.
Yeah, and additionally, I was not at the meeting with SEBA, but when Megan presented the sort of framework for the Innovation District, it seems like there was strong support at SEBA for such a standard to preserve the existing commercial artist space.
Yeah, and we have heard that from others as well who, are very familiar with the commercial market in the South End, that kind of understand, while this is a limited area, there is still some risk there. And so this would add a layer of protection. So
To me, it makes some rational sense to do it this way, to do it incrementally. If we start having some unintended consequences or things start happening that we don't want to, development usually goes pretty slowly, so we can come back and revisit it. But I think, Michael, what you're raising though is a good point for us to all think about as we go through this process.
Yeah, I should probably also say that, you know, there are a couple of very large sites in the proposed districts that, you know, if they were to be developed as the first projects of the innovation district, they could accommodate, you know, upwards of, you know, hundreds of units, which could absorb the significant demand for housing in the area, potentially, you know, slow the need for new space in the innovation district. I think that's also something to consider, that the commission should have time over the next few years to sort of see how this plays out and to make revisions. So with that, it seems like the commission is fairly comfortable with such a proposal. I think what we'll do is go ahead and add that to the draft amendment for your review next time. And obviously we can continue this discussion. So just moving along, the next issue that was raised was with respect to hotels and hospitality. And so, you know, Michael and Eves in particular discussed, you know, whether or not hotels should be permitted and, you know, advocated for some entitlement for hotels. It's our, you know, recommendation as staff that if the commission decides to allow hotels, that they should be limited in their application, and that the most appropriate and most easily administered standard would be to simply say no more than one hotel per lot. The rationale in support of allowing hotels, which you in the commission raised last time, was that the South End, because of its proximity to Amtrak and because it's such a desirable space in Burlington, could be a great destination for remote work and sort of a new era of remote workers. You know, maybe folks, you know, taking the train from New York or south to Burlington to work for a short term in hotels could support that. We've heard from some of the business community in the South End that it's important to have hotels nearby to help with recruitment. So that's something we've also considered. And also, I think Eves raised the point last time that the South End is increasingly and you know, has always been amenity rich and a destination for people playing in Burlington. And so to that extent, hotels could support that as well. But of course, this last bullet recognizes that any allowance for hotels in the district should balance that entitlement with the need to preserve space for the sort of key initiative here, which is to create more homes and more space for office and artists in the innovation district. The last thing I'll say here before I turn it over to you for discussion is that there are only a few lots in the innovation district to begin with. There's quite a few large lots, and a few of those lots are controlled by the city. It's difficult to imagine the city developing hotels on their own property. BED, I would include BED in that as well. One of the larger sites that's upwards of 4 acres, there is a development proposal in the works already. So realistically, if there was an allowance of 1 hotel per lot, we're talking at most, you know, probably 3-4 hotels in the innovation district. So with that, would love to hear thoughts on, you know, allowing hotels in the district.
So I could only see a few folks, so if you want to just chime in.
So with the per lot, I guess, obviously I advocated for these, but also agree with the, you know, that there shouldn't be too many of them and that they should be limited. But So if you like subdivide or something, how do you sort of see that playing out?
Yeah, I'll try and answer this, and Megan, if you want to chime in as well. I would say the amendment could say lots existing as of the date of adoption of the zoning amendment. So in the event that some of these larger lots are subdivided to create multiple lots, there couldn't be a sort of an abundance of hotels, I'd say.
If I
Yeah,
may,
I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead, Emily.
sorry, doesn't the proximity limit kind of address that? Because
think those
regardless,
are-
in some ways, regardless of the lot size, there's a proximity limit that kind of determines.
Those are
Yeah,
alternatives, right?
these are alternative sort of methods of regulating hotels. And, I will say city planning has tried to move away from the proximity limit as a regulation. I'll let Megan speak to the rationale for that more, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has come up as recently as our discussion about short-term rentals. And I think it's a challenging standard for us to implement because it's not totally transparent in terms of where certain uses could go, because it depends on where something exists today or yesterday or tomorrow. So the only place that I think that we're currently using this kind of standard is actually in relation to community houses in our current ordinance. That we do have a separation requirement between them. But we've tried not to introduce this in a lot of other cases because it provides a lot of uncertainty in terms of where things could go. I think a lot of the other tools that we've talked through in terms of how we could limit the proliferation carry some of the same challenges that you asked about, Michael, in terms of, if we say one per lot and a lot is subdivided, thinking about things like gross square foot or number of beds or rooms in a hotel kind of establishment. One would be a little bit of a shot in the dark in terms of what would be the right number. And two would also apply at an individual parcel level. So instead of kind of having the effect of limiting them across the district, it would also be at a site-by-site basis. So yeah, I think our kind of recommendation was to look at just limiting them per lot as probably the most workable tool.
Makes sense.
And
Yeah, but-
Alex, it looks like you might have a question on.
Yeah,
about
I'm
that.
just wondering, how many lots are there?
In the district,
Yeah,
Yeah, we should know that.
what
shouldn't we?
number are we talking about
I
here?
think it's like 8. Or 10. There's 10. There's not very many. And as Charles was saying, several of them are built out, and a number of them are owned by the city or Champlain College. So I think when we think about parcels where future development capacity might happen, we're again talking about an even smaller number of parcels where we may see any development occur, let alone a hotel. So, maybe 5 of those that could even be the subject of a hotel consideration.
So I guess I'm not sold on this one. Especially when I hear the limited number of lots. It doesn't seem like this fits in with this part of the south end. I'm not closed off to it, I'll say, but I guess I still need more convincing, because if hotels go up there, we've just cut down the number of lots where all the other things that we keep talking about are available. We talk about, we don't want a hotel, for example. I would put in the same issue with the hotel. We don't want a hotel to replace like what we already have there, the artist space and the other maker space and things like that. We don't want to encourage those to get torn down. We're not allowing them to get, we're not allowing them to be converted for housing. So we don't want them certainly to be converted for a hotel, I wouldn't think. That leaves a really small number of other places, and those other places, what we do want to do is put in housing. We want to put in other community amenities for down there. I guess I'm just not convinced the hotel is the right thing. We have other areas in the city that might be more appropriate for that. Our downtown is It might be more beneficial downtown. I could imagine, maybe one in this area, but I don't know how you limit it to just one.
Yeah,
One.
But I guess I have concerns because while in the ideal, it might be a nice thing to have, given the limited number of space that we have, this is not at the top of my list to have there. There are other things I'd much rather have in that area.
Andy, if can I respond to you?
Sure. Oh, sure.
Yeah, I just think, yeah, I agree with you. So like, obviously it's something that I advocated for. I think it's highly complementary to what is, if we're talking innovation, we're talking about like knowledge sharing and those types of things. And, knowledge sharing occurs when you bring in new people and new ideas. So I think it has a really important role to play, but I agree that, and, I know obviously Charles and Megan have thought a lot about this, but I guess like in like a perfect world, you'd be able to sort of plan things out on the gross square footage basis. You'd say, no, it can't exceed X amount. I understand that that's super hard because you don't know like what the design or the footprint is in advance. One thought I did have on this, which would definitely, like, the developers would not love this, but I think it's consistent with the expectations. And if there's enough demand, it would probably be able to be overcome anyway, is to allow it if there is some like residential component associated with that particular building. There's like plenty of models for these. Oftentimes they're done with condos, but there's no reason it couldn't be done with any type of housing. So that is one thought I had, and there are other examples of that. And that would, kind of like.
Yeah, and am I frozen?
Nope.
You hear me?
Nope.
Okay, sorry, my internet is being a little funky right now. I would say, Michael, to the last point, that's a great point about only allowing them if they are in support of some other mix of uses or in buildings with other uses. That is an approach that we could put kind of on the options list here that is, I think, more workable than some of these others. Again, understanding it would happen at any site within the district kind of level. But it's certainly possible that we could say something like they're only allowed in buildings if they make up, no more than X% of the or if they're in buildings with residential uses, I should say. So that's something we can talk about as an option for further discussion.
Or some other form of community amenity that's desirable. I'm always reminded of the mixed, my favorite mixed use project in DC is a hotel and fire station. And so you could see something similar. Maybe not a fire station, but just important.
Again, while I'm not totally sold on this, I think that kind of suggestion, Michael, is one that I'd probably be more open to than just saying you could have a hotel. Yeah, if we mixed it with some other amenity, and I wouldn't just limit it to housing, it could be housing, but if we mixed it with something else that's, one of the things that we really do want down there, at least half being the other thing and maybe half being the hotel.
There's
like that.
There's some really awesome examples out there of gallery space in hotels. I think of the in Cincinnati, Hotel 21C, I think, and then that's a developer out of Memphis and Louisville that does that really well. So that's a perfect example that would be very consistent with what we're talking about.
Yes. So blended use. I'd be, again, while I'm not sold on it, I'd be a lot more open to a blended use like that than just the standalone hotel. I think that's a great suggestion.
Great. Yeah, it sounds like we have a few options that we can bring to you next time, sort of menu of options for you to consider. Don't want to spend too much time on this one issue. Julia, looks like.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Andy said. I'll be brief, but yeah, I also think, with those limitations and specifying that it could provide some other community use, I think this could be an asset to the district. But I also wanted to just note that in the public engagement summary that we had, the public was not very in favor of hotels in this area either. So I just want to note or a blended use that would serve that, because there is going to be so much of a focus on residential.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that point, Julia. I was going to offer that as well. It's important to keep that as a reference point. And just to note, it does seem like both Charles and I are having some internet stability issues. So just a heads up for all of you. Hopefully we'll be able to make it through this meeting, but
I am too, by the way. I think it's
Okay.
a Burlington thing.
maybe it's a Burlington Telecom thing then. So,
Yeah, I have Burlington Telecom.
okay,
All
go
right.
ahead, Charles.
Great. All right, moving along. I think that sort of concludes the land use portion of the presentation tonight. So we're going to move to the urban design standards, and just to sort of recap again, there's a whole menu of sort of regulations here: lot occupation and building placement, which includes, you know, these standards here, frontage build out and setback, building form, which includes height and bulk, and then parking and service. So the building bulk standards include floor area ratio, maximum footprint for floors 1 through 6, and then a reduced footprint for floors 7 through 8. So first, just to talk a bit about floor area ratio. This graphic conveniently was designed by Burlington's own Julie Campoli to illustrate floor area ratio for those of you who need a recap. But the text on the left is the CDO definition of floor area ratio, which is fairly standard. We had initially thought that it could use some revisioning, and I think it probably could benefit from some clarification, specifically regarding parking and whether or not parking structures are included in the calculation of floor area ratio. But we just want to open up and sort of maybe help facilitate this discussion about FAR. So an FAR of 2.5 is when you look at some sites conceptually, very conceptually actually, you can see that 2.5 is quite generous. So this is an extremely generic site plan that would adhere to the suite of standards in the proposed amendment, but this is for a property within the district on Pine Street. It's about 4 acres, I believe, 209,000 square feet, with approximately double that in floor area. So that gets you to a FAR of about 1.97 or 2. And this could accommodate, you know, this site with an FAR of 300 residential units, upwards of 50,000 square feet of commercial or the other non-residential space, and significant parking up to 460 spaces. And so just that is one site. We have another site, a larger site with a greater mix of uses. And so this gets up to the sort of maximum. Again, this is just for the purposes of this discussion. It's not to suggest, you know, the city's goal or vision for any property here. So this is an FAR 2.5, around 500 residential units, and what I would say is a very significant amount of non-residential space. The red mass there at the top of the screen would be an office building with commercial space at the bottom. So 180,000 square feet is probably more than we would see on any given site in the Innovation District. So you could imagine that some of that space could be converted in this model to residential, pushing the units up above 500 while staying within that 2.5 FAR threshold. So again, we're just including that here to make sure that the commission is comfortable with that standard, because I know we touched on it very briefly last time, and there were a couple questions. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments about floor area ratio.
Charles, just
Yeah.
as a point of information on this, it looked like you're getting to it on your next slide, but could you remind us what the proposed building height is for this district?
Yes, so in the amendment that we presented to you last time, it was up to 8 stories without much specificity. And you'll see here in just a few slides that we've actually thought quite a bit more about how we might regulate a little bit more closely building height in the district. And so that definitely would like to have that discussion as well. If you'd like, I can go ahead and present that material and then we can sort of talk about them.
No,
holistically.
we could keep going on this, but let me just ask a couple more questions to make sure that I'm clear and that we're all clear on this.
Sure.
So if we're able to go up to 8 stories,
Yep.
if somebody, and yet we have an FAR of 2.5, if someone wanted to basically, I don't know that anyone would do this, but if they wanted to build on the whole lot, cover the whole lot, then they could build, even though they're, the zoning would allow to go up to 8 stories, they could only build like, 2 stories on the full lot and one story on half the lot. So part of it would be 3 stories and the rest of it would be 2. Is that the way it works?
Yes, but with a couple caveats. One being that there is the lot coverage standard.
Yes.
80% max or 90% max given a certain high amount of green stormwater infrastructure.
Okay.
On these large sites, there would also have to be streets, most likely new streets, space for infrastructure, that sort of thing. And so, yes, if ultimately after you account for open space and connectivity, a 2.5 story building across the entire site would equal 2.5 FAR.
Okay. And then the last sort of question along those lines is the FAR of 2.5 more or less the staff recommendation on this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, great.
Yeah,
Thanks
and
for
I think that the combination of these graphics is just also helpful to illustrate that while we have some opportunities to have more refined discussions about height, it does help to illustrate that that limit really means that a site like this couldn't be built out, essentially all of its land area to a height of 8 stories. There would have to be variation or smaller buildings, maybe that are all fairly tall, a mix of stories, whatever the case may be, but they wouldn't be able to build it the whole surface with 8-story buildings.
Great. Thanks for those clarifications. I understand stuff better now. So anyone else have questions, comments on this?
Michael has his hand up and then me.
Okay, just chime
Oh.
in.
You can go, Alex.
Just
would-
wondering about what's the right, height limit to think about in Burlington in the south end, like, is 5 or 6 stories, better for a small city, or do we miss an opportunity to have greater density? Like, with such a big space and a major zoning change right now, and have it at 7 or 8, with the understanding that there will be varied building heights. And not all of it will be 7 or 8 stories. What do you all think about that? What do you want to see?
I could,
Don't all
no one
jump in
else
at
is-
once.
since no one else is speaking, I will. I think having varied heights is okay. I think it could be nice for our cityscape. And one of the things that I've observed over the years, maybe this is just for myself, but I think this carries through for a lot of other people as well, is within limits, like I wouldn't want it to go up, I'll call it too high, whatever too high is. Really a bad thing. And while it might be something that might take a little bit of getting used to, over time, you get used to it. There are other things that you don't get used to. You don't get used to necessarily poor design. You don't get used to like some of the traffic flows or pedestrian flows. You don't get used to orientation, things like that. If it hurts the streetscape, it's really hard to improve on that. But just in terms of building height, that's something that you get used to after a while. And maybe not even after a while, you could get used to it pretty quickly. So going up to 6, 7, 8 stories in this area doesn't worry me. I wouldn't want to go up, 10 stories or more, or something like that, but this height doesn't really worry me, especially
What-
when it's broken up the way Megan and Charles are talking about.
I have a comment.
Thank you.
Oh, I had one, it's complimentary, so apologies, Emily. I just wondered if staff envisioned as part of this process, as we move further along, additional density bonuses that kind of goes to the height discussion. You know, if you kind of do your maximum height, you're kind of using up all your FAR, but I don't know, just wonder if there was any thinking around that, particularly for, again, going back to the subject of amenities, developing more amenities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You remember we have, which I think we'll talk about in a second, with the amendment that we showed, we proposed to regulate or to limit the floor plate of any floors 7 and 8 to 10,000 square feet, whereas other floors 1 through 6 could be up to 15,000. And we have not contemplated whether or not that would also come with a related increase in FAR. I suppose it could. You know, if you're and you achieve that exemption from that 7th and 8th floor limitation by meeting certain green building performance standards. And so we could say, yes, if you're building to LEED Gold or Passive House or whatever other standard the commission feels comfortable with, you also get a little bit of bonus in FAR. Maybe you get up to 2.75 or 3.
Yeah, I meant more not offsetting, Charles, more in the sense that instead of, say, having the capacity to do 2 buildings of 8-story, you know, or 1 building of 8-story and another building of 6-story, and then using up your FAR, you did 2 buildings of 8 stories because you did just like a black box theater. I'm just like making things up, but like, you know, maybe that's something that just washes out as we have the community engagement. But that's obviously kind of a nice part of the FAR approach, is that you get to achieve certain objectives in a fairly tried and true way.
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit to this. We have not contemplated a lot of bonuses at this point. We have contemplated more what I'll call by right exceptions to some of the limits. So instead of having, you know, discretionary bonuses, we have said, for example, the example that Charles was just mentioning, you know, that you could have a bigger floor plate on the upper floors if the building meets a high performing standard. And it's, you know, purely an administrative test to understand if that has been met and gives additional development capacity. So there are a couple things tucked into this draft ordinance like that. But in general, in terms of like the pure bonus kind of approach that you're asking about, that's actually something that the city has kind of pulled out of its regulations over the last several years, because we found that many of them were not being taken advantage of. We weren't always able to offer additional height or density that was meaningful in order to actually get what we were asking for. And, you know, for Andy and others that have been on the, Emily, for the, you know, that have been on the commission for a while, you'll remember that we've been saying, like, let's just ask for what we want. And so we've tried to take the approach at the outset with this amendment that we're just kind of telling people, this is what you can build and this is what we want. But happy to entertain other questions about that.
No, that totally makes sense. I think that's a great approach, but just curious.
So on the height question, I think I heard a couple other voices in there, but I'm not sure.
I wanted to say that I think the height matters. I think, you know, I remember watching a movie called like Livable Scale about how buildings relate to the street front and the walking experience. And they were saying that like a building on the street front that's higher than 6 stories just has a disconnection, and you don't feel as connected to the street and what's happening in the urban landscape. So I think that there is definitely an opportunity to have height higher than 6 stories, but possibly like within the interior blocks. And thinking about what we did with form-based code and how, you know, if you have something that's 6 stories, you know, so many feet set back, it becomes 10 stories, you don't feel that 10 stories. So it's a better streetscape. But there's also something to be said for people who live in the buildings, being connected to what's happening in the street and having a sense of place and a sense of belonging to the neighborhood and community.
Charles, if you want to skip ahead to the discussion about height, I think that some of the feedback we're hearing is kind of consistent with the discussions that we've been having. So let's talk about this more fully.
Yeah, sure. So just reminder, 8 stories without any sort of specific standards. And so a question that we pose to you is, should the amendment more closely regulate building height? And we're sharing here the specific height area map from the form code that a few of you have already mentioned. And so this map regulates height based on location upon certain streets. So taller buildings, for example, in that sort of hatched area A, and smaller, lower buildings on Church Street, and then other locations downtown. Another precedent that's in the proposed Trinity Amendment would be to permit 8-story buildings within a certain proximity to Colchester Avenue. So these are both approaches that we could take in this amendment. Obviously, and I think we touched on this a bit last time, we don't have the benefit of having a granularity of block network within specifically these larger sites. We've also got sites on Pine Street that back up to the Barge Canal that may or may not be appropriate for additional height. But so the question is, should the amendment more closely regulate height? And if so, would an approach like this very conceptual version on the right be something you'd be comfortable with? So, just to walk you through this, those areas in red could be, up to 8 stories, and in blue, just up to 4 stories. And, you may decide to flip these. You may, decide to, like Emily said, try and locate the tallest buildings at the center of districts. But without having that street network already in place, it's a bit difficult, if not impossible, to achieve the sort of same standard of specificity that the form code map does. We could take an approach like the Trinity Amendment and say, along with a map like this, if you are, within 150, 200 feet of Champlain Parkway and Lakeside Avenue, you get up to 8 stories. If you're within 200 feet of Pine Street center line, you only get up to 4, but beyond that, you can go up to 8. So these are, we can bring a sort of menu of options to regulate height more specifically, but I think this hopefully is helpful to generate some discussion tonight.
Emily, I don't see you here because you're not on my screen, but do you have any thoughts on that one? Because this is, I think, following up a little bit on what you were talking about. I'm not sure if it's getting what you were talking about, but it was.
Yeah, I think it's getting to what I'm talking about. It sounds like we're going to get into it more deeply.
Okay.
I do have a quick comment. I'm totally open to more height even than 8 stories. The economics support it. The only exception to that would be that making sure that folks in the Lakeside neighborhood don't have the feeling of a Panopticon building right above them over the tracks there. So I do think it makes some sense to accommodate that existing neighborhood.
And I'd echo Emily's comments on it. The streetscape is important, and making sure that the scale right along the street's important. And then as you step back away from the street, I think that can accommodate some of the greater height. But you do want to have it in scale for this along the street.
I'm in agreement. I like the idea of having a livable scale, whatever the correct term is, more like 6 stories at the street level, and using setbacks or other, I don't know exactly how you do it, to have greater height in the interior, set back from the street.
Yeah, and the other way that we've talked about this is that when we think about the streetscape and how new buildings could relate to the existing streetscape, we have a couple different types of streetscapes that we would be looking at in this district. So just kind of this illustration of blue versus red is a really easy way to pick out what we're thinking about here in terms of, there is a pretty established built environment along Pine Street today. And thinking about whether there could be some setbacks for taller buildings along Pine Street to help new streetscape enhancements feel more compatible with what exists along that street versus areas that are kind of set back in really new districts. Like we're, in the Champlain Parkway vicinity between Lakeside and Sears Lane, we're really talking about large undeveloped lots where there really isn't a streetscape that exists. And so maybe in that area, we're okay with something that looks a little different, and kind of building what that streetscape looks like from scratch. And so that was where we were thinking about, maybe along Pine Street, some shorter buildings closer to the street, but maybe along the Parkway or Lakeside Avenue, there's an opportunity for taller buildings along the streetscape. We also know that the existing Innovation Center is one of the taller buildings in this area. And I think it stands at close to 60 feet. So, if we're talking about taller buildings right across Lakeside Avenue, they would kind of be compatible with some of the existing streetscape that does exist there. So there are a couple different ways that we could think about this, but that was just some thoughts about that there are maybe a different hierarchy of streetscapes that could be created through this height overlay.
I like that idea, Megan. Like, you have got a blank asphalt parking lot to work with. So who knows what that street will look like? Does it have to be a street? Can we dust off the plans for the Winooski Wonder Dome?
Very funny.
Hey, that idea is out there,
It is out there.
way out there, but
Should also just real quickly say that, we do envision ultimately some uptake of buildings, mass timber buildings, other types of sustainable construction. And as we understand it, Vermont is on its way to adopting the 2021 building code, which does increase allowable height for mass timber buildings up to 9 stories, up to 18 stories actually in some cases.
What kind of building is that?
So mass timber, which is a particularly, most would argue, sustainable type of construction built out of heavy laminate timber frames that are very fire resistant and structurally just as strong, if not stronger than steel and concrete.
You can build
It could
9-story
potentially be
buildings?
cheaper.
Wow.
It can be
But I think that's
cheaper.
that's the issue, is that it had previously been limited to shorter buildings.
And
Yeah.
that type of construction has a exponential, like a very low carbon impact
Yes.
versus like using steel. And generally, if you build anything above 4 stories, you have to use steel. But now there's some new design technology where they're using a special kind of wood that is developed in a different way that has the same properties as steel, or it can handle a bigger building. And so instead of using carbon, it actually captures carbon because wood has carbon in it.
That's right. So just one other thing to keep in mind, we're happy to share more information about that at our next meeting.
I think that's fantastic, Charles.
Great, good to hear. We'll bring more on that next time. Real quickly, just on that 7th and 8th floor plate limitation, we're including here the language from the downtown form code for any new buildings and or renovations over 50,000 square feet have to be approved as high performance buildings as determined by some of these standards listed here. So I think, if this is a standard that the commission feels comfortable keeping in the amendment, allowing those floors 7 and 8 to be exempted from that floor plate restriction, we do propose just bringing in this language from the form code to allow not just passive house as we previously recommended, but some of these other standards like LEED, net zero certification, that sort of thing to qualify.
And just to be clear, this is the form code language. We were thinking that the A, B, C, and D are the parts that would be applicable to this discussion, which are the certification types themselves.
Thanks for clarifying that. I know we're running short on time, so we're going to skip here. This is a fairly important issue. So we've talked tonight about the lack of a street network within some of these larger sites in the innovation district. And I think early on in the process, we had considered the idea of creating new streets on the official map, or requiring a minimum block perimeter standard for sites. So the amendment does not require these new streets, but in thinking about it more, I think we do recommend that the commission does at least discuss this and is aware of this issue in the amendment. I think there's two options here. That would be to amend the official map to draw new streets, which we're not recommending for a number of reasons. It is very prescriptive, not flexible for developers. We simply don't know some site conditions that might dictate where streets can simply go. We also think the block perimeter standard in giving developers that flexibility could ultimately result in better connectivity and sort of urban design performance. So that's the question. Just a little bit more. So this is a concept for how the district could build out if we included a block perimeter standard of something like 1,600 feet. So a 1,600-foot block perimeter, for example, includes 4 legs that are each 400 feet, which is consistent with Burlington's downtown fabric now. Michael spoke last time of Portland's, the Pearl District, I think it is, in Portland, which has a block pattern of 800 feet, which is much smaller. But the idea here is to, again, create a granularity of blocks and require developers that they build out new streets to meet this minimum block perimeter standard. There's a couple other things to consider here. Should exemptions be granted for properties that are adjacent to sensitive natural areas or infrastructural barriers? For example, Champlain Parkway. Until the city takes the parkway over, no new streets will be allowed to connect to the parkway to create new intersections. And it's not a given that even after the city takes over the parkway, that new streets will be constructed to create blocks. So I think it is reasonable that if a block perimeter standard is sort of the chosen method here, that we do make some exemptions for streets like Champlain Parkway, and to say in lieu of completing a block with a street, a developer can provide a multi-use path with a minimum dimension of sidewalk and bike path, that sort of thing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Any thoughts from anyone?
Yeah. That multi-use path is something I've been thinking about. I'm sure you'll do this, but just make those things like super wide, right? Like you don't want it to be a South Burlington bike path. You want it to be like, what's the example everybody get, Curitoba or whatever. Like you want it to be super, really wide and really usable. But I think that's a great option. Would like to think about the block perimeter. That's a hard thing to visualize, but thank you.
Yeah, I will say that block perimeter, just briefly, in my previous job in Raleigh, that's generally the city's method of guaranteeing and getting new streets. There's many assemblages and large sites in the city that are being developed, and lacking that internal street network, the city does have a block perimeter standard that is intended to really replicate the granularity of blocks elsewhere in the city. And so I think it's a fairly common approach. I think South Burlington has a similar regulation.
Any feedback from your stakeholder group on this block perimeter size with regard to the consequences for development?
Speaking to property owners, we've not really heard any concerns about any proposed block perimeter standards, regardless of what the standard is. At some point, we even talked about a 2,500 foot standard, which would just guarantee a much more limited sort of street network. We've not discussed a smaller standard like the example you shared from Portland. With the community, though, it's very clear that the community would love to see a very permeable district. And when I say permeable, I mean visually, in terms of connectivity through sites. I think the community would like to see many options for pedestrian and bike connectivity, not just on streets, but through blocks. And to that extent, yeah, I think block perimeter standard could help to guarantee some of that permeability.
Could I just add, sorry, one thing? I know Alex and Emily both are trying to get in. I just want to follow up on the specific question about stakeholders. We have discussed this concept generally, not this number specifically. And I do think, there was some recognition of the potential benefits for very large sites. I think there was just a question mark about what would it actually mean for the options for layouts of new streets and pathways. So I know that's a question we're kind of continuing to noodle on as well. Sorry, go ahead, Alex and Emily.
Just what I was thinking about, cul-de-sacs increase traffic congestion because there's no opportunity for, talking about cars and drivers again, no opportunity for people to go, they all basically all funnel into the arterials. And that's essentially what's happening here with Champlain Parkway being a limited access road, is that some of these blocks will dead end against the fence of the Champlain Parkway. So, I don't know what to do about that, but it's something I'm thinking about.
I have a comment on that, but
Please.
let's go to Emily before that, though, because I know she was in the queue before me.
I just wanted to say that I'm enthusiastic about the idea of multi-use paths being accepted in lieu of streets. And I think that because this is a basically building a new neighborhood, and a large one, that I'd like to see this really move away from car dependence. And I think it can have great connectivity to downtown. It can have it's got enough people that could possibly live here that it could be connected in a meaningful way to public transportation. And that, having great streets that are just for biking and walking would be terrific. And we've seen, it's interesting because we are like a model for success with Church Street Marketplace, that we could create more spaces like that in development like this. So I think having the break between buildings with streets is wonderful, but I don't think all of them need to be streets. I think that they could be bicycle and pedestrian only streets.
Yeah, so, the piece I wanted to add with regard to the Champlain Parkway is at our last meeting, Charles, you had some really creative ideas about that and ways to connect that aren't necessarily allowable right now, but I wouldn't want to let go of that vision that you were talking about for it. So, I wouldn't want, I think we want to keep some of the things that you were talking about as a possibility in the future. So not to cut off the ability to do what you were talking about. And I don't remember all the details of what you were talking about. I just remember that it sounded really good. And, almost make once you, say, should we revisit, the way the Champlain Parkway is, it doesn't have connections, that it's limited access. And that may not happen for a while, but it sounds like it could happen at some point. So if it could happen at some point, let's not block it off now and prevent that from being able to happen later. So Just,
Yeah.
I would keep in mind the vision that you laid out for us at the last meeting and make sure we don't lose the ability to do that.
I think some of those things were about orienting, active building frontages along the parkway in anticipation of future improvements and other
Yeah.
standards, which I definitely think this could be a complement to. One thing I did want to add, and this is thinking maybe more specifically about Alex's concern about the creation of cul-de-sacs, is that this graphic that Charles has here is trying to help illustrate what 1,600 feet as a kind of maximum perimeter of a block might look like, but they're all fairly uniform. Another way this could be laid out, especially thinking about the larger sites that are just to the west of the parkway, is more like these kind of longer rectangular blocks that you see in the bottom right of this image. So you could almost imagine in the bottom left that you could have, some longer, skinnier versions of those where instead of a street running east and west and dead ending into the parkway, a street could maybe run north and south and actually fully connect between Lakeside and Sears Lane. So this wouldn't necessarily require that blocks be perfectly square or maybe there would be a minimum dimension on one side, but it could still allow for some flexibility for new internal circulation based on how a site plan develops.
Thank you.
I had one question and a quick comment. The question is, I know we can't have automotive connections to Champlain Parkway until we get to take ownership of it. Can we have pedestrian or bike connections to it prior to taking ownership?
Yeah, so currently the plans do actually not contain any bike ped infrastructure on the west side of the parkway. In this portion of the parkway between Lakeside and Sears Lane, the multi-use path is actually on the east side.
Okay.
There's a couple of portions of lawn and then some areas of GSI. But I would say that once the city takes it over, I would imagine that there would be a discussion about the public realm and how that could be designed and potentially built out. That's also an option for any developer to build in on their own site some degree of linear park or something like that could satisfy their open space requirement, that could satisfy their GSI requirement to provide some street trees, other sorts of amenities. But yeah, there's nothing there now, but I think it's in everybody's interest to get something like that.
So the other, I guess my comment would be not to go back to the density bonus thing, but like, given folks want it to be porous and obviously giving right away, leaving right away undeveloped is not in the interest of the developer necessarily, as they want to maximize the development space, but some incentive to potentially make the perimeter block smaller. I think we have that like a little bit in what you wrote, right? Like, isn't that 80-90% distinction, like help with that a little bit? But maybe if we're going to take this approach, enhance that even more. I don't know if there's just a thought.
Yeah, I think, lot coverage is one way we could do that. Maybe an FAR, we talked about not giving bonuses, but yeah, I think we could look at some options and bring those back to you for next time.
Yeah, and we could also, I think to that point, Michael, kind of sketch out an idea for if the sort of ideal maximum building size was, however many square feet, as we start to layer all of these goals that we have for site design and orientation, how does that affect that potential maximum build out? I know that's something that some of the planning commissioners might remember that we did in the downtown when we were contemplating some of the special height overlays around the mall. It was like, basically, as we took the 2 street right of ways for St. Paul and Pine Street off the table and said, we want these to be public realm, we added back the opportunity for some additional development capacity in the block in the middle. So understand the kind of question, and we can do some sketching to see how this would influence or affect, I guess, that maximum build out.
So, Charles, I'm just being mindful right now of the time. This is a great discussion. I don't want to cut it short, but you know how much more you have for us.
That's actually the last issue we had for discussion. So we'll go ahead and stop sharing. That was it. Those were the issues I think that we had raised. Julia raised a question about remediation that we can bring back more information on next time. Specifically, we'll hope to have some discussions with DPW about what is known on the sites and what sorts of remediation could be required or could satisfy their standards.
Okay,
And if
Great.
it's okay, Andy, I can say something 30 seconds or less that speaks
Sure,
to
that's
Julia's
fine.
question. We do have some standards in our zoning ordinance that talk about remediation, especially of sites that are like capital B brownfield sites, you know, and actually help incentivize redevelopment and cleanup of those sites by waiving some of the underlying zoning standards in order to help facilitate a remediation plan that could help with redeveloping the site. So that's something that exists outside of the kind of zoning amendment that we're talking about right now. It already applies citywide to any contaminated sites.
Any final questions, comments on this before we close it out? I assume this is coming back at our next meeting or one shortly thereafter.
Yes.
Any final questions or thoughts on this from anyone? Okay. I think this was a great discussion. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Charles, and all the commissioners. I think this went really well. So we'll close that. We'll go on to item 9, which are commissioner items. I see A is November meeting schedule. Was there something to that?
Do you want to talk about
No.
this, Charles, or do you want me to?
I can talk about it. I see Emily's hand.
I just had a commissioner item question.
Let's do this schedule and then we'll come to you.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, the issue with November scheduling is that the first scheduled date is Election Day. The second scheduled Planning Commission meeting is the week of Thanksgiving. So just want to raise that with you and suggest if there's any concerns about it, potentially moving, just having one November meeting on the 15th of November. Otherwise, we can keep it as scheduled, but understand there may be some conflicts.
The one meeting, 15th of November would work well for me. How about for others? Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Okay.
I think, thanks for raising that issue. All right, looks like we'll do that. Emily,
I'm wondering if you could give us an update on what's happening with the former YMCA site, which was supposed to be a hotel. I mean, I live right around the corner and it's just, you know, it's
graffiti.
become a really big issue. And I'm wondering if there is if there's anything that we could do as a commission to address some of the issues around graffiti. Like I know other cities have standards around fencing and, or, you know, to prevent access to a building or, you know, fencing on the roof line and things like that within the ordinance. And I'm wondering if there's any best practices that other cities have used because the building's obviously not being maintained. And so anyways, I'm curious if you guys have an update on what's happening there.
Yeah, great question. I know only a little bit about the building's current status, which is that, yeah, that the hotel proposal has been languishing. And I do think the building, that there may be a search for a new owner for the building. I'm not sure what that means in terms of the permit status for the hotel, if it has fully expired or if they have relinquished the permits. I could check in with Scott Gustin and Bill Ward to give you more of a full response, see if they can help provide more full response to you about that piece. I mean, we can talk about whether or not there's anything else that we could be looking at through zoning with regard to graffiti, but you know, one thing I'll just say is that we do know graffiti is a big problem in the city right now in general. You know, we're seeing it on building facades that are right on the street. We're even seeing it on top of public art, which previously had been a pretty decent deterrent to graffiti. So it is something that Bill Ward's team has been working on. I think they, for the last couple summers, they've hired a graffiti team that has been going out and actively repainting graffiti as it is reported. And they're just trying to keep up with it as quickly as they can. So happy to take a look at that and see if there's anything else that we could bring for the commission's consideration. But I think it's probably a bigger kind of societal issue than just what zoning could address at this point.
Yeah, I think in that building's case, that requiring some fencing on the roof line would address some of the higher level graffiti. Because there's just such easy access to the second story through the escape ladders and things like that.
Mhm.
And then I wondered, I mean, you said there may be a search for a new owner. Do you know if that property is, I know they were in risk of defaulting with the bank.
Yeah, I don't want to speak any more about that because I'm not 100% sure on the details.
Right.
So yeah.
Sure.
There is, I think we do have like a vacant building ordinance that might come into play with this one, I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I do know that Bill Ward has been involved in some work around that building, some stabilization of the building, securing it as well. So I can ask him if he could reach out to you and
Sure, I'm curious. It's a big part of my neighborhood.
Mhm.
And it's just such a great building, and seeing it be run down just feels like such a shame, and like to see
absolutely
forward.
Agreed.
Thanks for that. Any other commissioner comments? Any committee reports? All right, then we'll move on to item 10, minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept the communications? Motion by Julia. Is there a second? Seconded by Alex. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Raise your hand. Any opposed? We have our minutes and communications. Last item is adjournment. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Emily, seconded by Michael. All those in favor of the motion, say aye. Raise your hand. We stand adjourned. Thank you all. I think this was a great discussion we had tonight. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.